Hello sewing friends, Joanne Banko back here with part 2 of the two-tone tote. We've sewn those top seams and pressed them towards the outside fabric, and you can see it looks nice and smooth on the right side. We're now ready to go ahead and pin the side seams, so we're going to line up those seams directly on top of one another, and we're going to sew each side seam from one end to the other. We're getting close to wrapping up this tote. And now that I got my big long side seams pinned, I'm going to go ahead and sew each one of those. And I do want to back stitch at the beginning here. So remember, these are long seams. I use that same 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I will go down both sides of these. You'll see when I get up to the seam, I have very carefully pinned that together. So it's going to be important when we do our final round of top stitching on this bag. So just take a look here. I've pinned those seam allowances so that they're going to match, hopefully pretty exact. Just going to go a little slower there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue sewing both of these, and I'll see you back here when I'm finished. All right, both side seams are done, and now it's time to go ahead and box out those corners. So I've made just a little template. I have pinned it to the corner here where the side seam and the unsewn bottom seam is. So I'm going to go ahead and just snip that. Of course, you could use a ruler, but I like to use a template for this. Especially, I did these in a class, and with a class it's always nice to have something easy for them to pick up and accomplish that process. Okay, so I've got that one done. See, I cut out the side seam there, and I am going to go back and reinforce that in just a minute, but let's get the other one done here. Line that up. And notch that out. So sometimes the boxed corners are done just by simply meeting the bottom seam with the side seam, and you wouldn't have this pre-cut. Again, because this was done for a class, I wanted to make it as streamlined as possible, and this makes it really easy when you're writing instructions, maybe without pictures, just to be able to tell what to do here in that step that we're going to do shortly. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to reinforce these side seam areas where that got clipped. Just get a little back stitch there, sew to the end, back stitch that. The other side, and I've already got my other two corners all finished. I'll show you them in just a minute. Alright, so you can see one corner there, the next corner there, and then at my opposite end for my inside piece, or my lining, I've got my corner notched out there and there. What I've got left here now is the bottom seam to sew. So I'm going to go ahead and sew both of those bottom seams. Okay, before I go ahead and box these last two corners, I did want to make a note. I inadvertently neglected to tell you that what you want to do on this lining bottom seam, I've determined this is my lining side, you just want to sew a couple inches at each end and then leave the rest of this open, because this is what we're going to use to reach our hand inside and turn that bag right side out. So I like to leave an opening in the bottom. And then just make note of the way I stitched these two ends. I went and stopped at the stitching line, pivoted, and stitched straight towards the raw edge and then backstitch there. That's going to make it easier when we actually close that opening at the very end. All right, go ahead and box these corners. And we are, as I said, very near the finish line here. Now, as in everything, pressing is one of the most important things that you do. And again, I want to make sure, I want to go back to this other end. I know you can't see it, but I'm going back to this other end to see which way did I press that seam allowance. It's going that way. And so I want this same one to go that way. I want those to match. My opposite side went in the opposite direction. Let's get those seams nested there. And I'll pin that in place. So you can see the steps for making the entire tote bag really are very, very simple. Very straightforward. Follow I'm following the same order basically that I have in the written instructions that I've provided, so that everything will match up for you. Back stitch there. So across that corner. And you know, when I designed this bag, I'll tell you what I did. I made this from pattern transfer cloth and just basted it together really quick to kind of play with the sizing a little bit and then determine that cutout for the box corner, because the wider you go or the shallower you go, it really does change the shape of the bag. So you kind of want to find a nice balance there. I won't say that there's necessarily a right or wrong, but sometimes if that cutout is a little bit too wide, it'll make your bag look a little bit awkward. And if it's a little too narrow, it's not going to give you enough bottom area on that bag to sufficiently put stuff in your bag. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So I like to use just that 2.5 inch square for this particular measurement. And the measurement of the bag itself really, again, is just kind of an average. I wanted to make it similar to a shopping bag size, something that would be easy to handle for all ages. All right, I've got that done. Now I am going to go ahead and take a picture of this so that you can see this a little bit better. All right, my bag has been pulled out to the right side, and you can see my bottom seam in my lining, those extra seam, open seam allowances are turned and pressed under. And at this point, I need to decide if I want to go ahead and make this bag to be reversible. If I do, the simple thing that I want to do here is use a hand needle and thread and invisibly as possible stitch those two folded edges together so that I can close up that opening. That will make a nice neat finish on the bottom. Nothing saying you couldn't top stitch that and have a top stitched seam on the bottom. It is on the bottom after all. Think about that. So that might not be a big deal. But I'm not concerned about making this reversible. I'm going to go ahead and close up this bottom. And there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can use a simple straight stitch along this edge. What I like to do is use a very narrow zigzag. So I'm going to select a zigzag on my machine and I'm going to make it a length of about 2.0, 2.5 maybe. 2.0 looks good, and I'm going to go down to a very narrow width of 1.5. Just get my foot right along the edge there. Make sure you start where you've got the opening there. Get those folded edges even. And I am going to backstitch just a little bit. I'm just basically skipping over that folded edge with the zigzag stitch. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit for you so that you can see that a little bit closer. Right along there. I'm going to find where my opening ends and put a pin there so I don't sew too much further than I need to. Just a simple zigzag to close that up. Back stitch. And hopefully I caught all the edges there. Yes, I did. So there you go. Let me pull that out flat. You can see that. Move that out. There we go. Nice, neat, and that makes a very strong seam as well. So if there's much pressure put on that bottom seam, that's going to be good and sturdy. All right, the last thing to do here is to tuck the lining inside the bag. Let me get that tucked in, and you're going to see in a minute. Okay, what I've done is I've gone ahead and given this top edge a really good press. You want to make sure, especially at these side seams, that you've got everything nice and smooth. Give that a good press all the way around the edge, and the very last step is going to be to top stitch this edge about 1/4 inch. You could do 2 lines of stitching if you want, but we used a 1/2 inch seam allowance here at the top, and I did that on purpose so that we'd catch a little bit more of that strap piece into the stitching there to give that strap a little bit of extra security there. Move over here so you can see that. We want to give that a real good stitching there. You may even want to reinforce that a little bit if you think these are going to get heavy use. All right, so I'm going to go back to straight stitch, and I'm going to go to my top stitch length, which is about 3.5, and again I'm going to set the machine for 1/4 inch so I can stitch 1/4 inch from the edge with my foot lining right up with that top edge. So that means I want my left-right shift or my stitch width set at 5.5. I usually like to start in a little bit of a inconspicuous space so that my beginning and my end doesn't show too much there. And we'll just go ahead and top stitch that edge. You want to be a little careful here because you want that to be nice and straight. That is going to show anytime you're doing top stitching. And then there's my tab that I've added. I haven't opened up my buttonhole yet. I'll do that in a minute, and then we'll just sew the button on the opposite side. And again, we'll be good to go. Realize that with that buttonhole, if you're going to make this bag reversible, at some point your tab for your buttonhole is going to show on the wrong side, and your button's going to be either inside or outside of your bag. So main thing is it just gives it something to close up. Usually when I do something like this, I do put it over my free arm in my machine, but I don't have the free arm set up here right now. I'm working on the flat surface. And I almost got to the point where I started. Just overlap those stitches, back stitch, I'll just take that out so that you can see what I've done there. So I'm going to go back just and reinforce that really close to that strap just to give that a little bit more strength, and I'll show you that just as soon as I'm finished. And if you take a look here, you can see I've got some extra reinforcement there for each of the straps. I went ahead and cut my buttonhole open, and I'm going to go and just make sure everything's even here. My side seams are at the side. Straps match. And I'll flip this over. Leave just a little bit of slack there for that. And then let's poke a pin right through the middle of that buttonhole so I can mark where my button needs to be sewn. Got that on a little thread there. Caught that on more than one thread. All right, let's try that over again. Make sure those straps are evened up. Flip that over and get that poked in there without being trapped. Wow, that just doesn't want to go. So, all right, so I'm going to go ahead. Third time's the charm, hopefully. Let's do that with a different pin, one that has smaller head. It's not going to get me into trouble here. Just like that. All right, so this is the point where I need to put my button, and I'm going to go ahead and make a little X there with my chalk. All right, one last thing to show you here. Finish up this bag. I'm going to go ahead and sew the button on with a button sewing foot. So the button sewing foot, there's a couple different types of these, but the one that I'm using here has a little lever, and that when that's pushed forward, it's going to create a little bit more slack in the button so that you can open and close that buttonhole a lot easier. So I want to make sure that's pushed forward. And there is a gap here that allows me to put that button right in the center, although this is a little bit of a thick button, so let's see if that's going to work. Yeah, that looks like that's going to work. Okay, so I've got that positioned. Let's get that snapped on. And in order to use this type of foot, you need to have a button sewing stitch. So I'm going to go into my buttonhole menu, and I'm going to select that button sewing stitch. And no, I'm not going to trust where that is. I'm going to go ahead and lower the needle on the right, on the left, and yes, I am clearing that just fine. So now we'll get this slipped underneath. Very carefully. Raise that foot up a little bit higher, get that slipped underneath. And X marks the spot. I'm going to get that positioned right there. Okay, make sure my presser foot is down. Again, I'm going to check that one more time, make sure that didn't shift. Okay, I am good to go and ready to sew. You can see how it's stitching right over that bar. That's going to give a little slack in that thread. Now I'm going to go ahead and stitch a second time for a little bit of strength there. I am not going to cut my thread. I'm going to raise my needle. I'm going to pull this forward so that I have a tail there. Snip those threads. Now we'll get that lined back up for that second line of stitching. And I'm going to see if I can get that pushed all the way back. If not, I'm going to have to go from the other end. Yeah, I think I can clear that. All right, again, we do a double check here. And even though that tied off, I'm going to go ahead and do a second time. Again, pull that gently forward. And at this point, what I want to do, see I've got that extra little slack there. I'm going to stop and I'm going to pull all of my threads to the bottom side and tie that off. So I'll go ahead and do that and neaten that up. And we are going to show you a final bag here in just a minute. And there you see the finished two-tone tote. I hope you enjoyed this sew-along, and I hope you'll join me for future sew-alongs. If you haven't already subscribed, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button and also sign up for notifications so you know when every new video is coming up live or released on the Let's Go Sew with Joanne Banko channel here. Thank you for joining me. Happy sewing!